Professor Mario Speranza is a child and adolescent psychiatrist from Paris, from Versailles University, and he is mainly working with adolescents. As you all know, there are separate adolescent psychiatry clinics uh, around the world yet, except a few places. Uh, we're all child and adolescent psychiatrists, but more concentrated on adolescent issues. And Professor Speranza is also the past president of Isapp. Okay, perhaps we can start, Mario, and see the other people coming, hopefully.
That's it. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
So thank you, Fusen, for inviting me to make this webinar. And I decided to talk about emotions in adolescence because I think that there's something very important in our clinical daily practice, dealing with emotions and emotions dysregulation in adolescence. So I will make my webinar will try to talk about some principles, some clinical issues, and I would like to share with you some of these thoughts. So first of all, just a very quick some quick knowledge about adolescence. You know that adolescence is really an unstable period of life between the security of childhood and the unknown promises of adulthood. There are many challenges at this moment, during this period. All start from changes in the physical, in the physic, in the body of the adolescent. But these physical changes create many other changes, and especially the fact that there's something, the emergence of a sense of self, that is something new, and so the adolescents are they need to develop a new experience, a new reflection on how the self functions in relation to other people. But at the same time, with the changes of the body, there is a change in the in everything, in all the things that are related to the sexual attachment, to the attachment to other peers, to social relationships. And there is a very important increase on the sense of independence and autonomy, which are very key challenges at this period. But so all this line of tension, becoming independent, accessing to sexuality, and growing a new sense of self are really potential gains for the adolescent, but at the same time are potential threats. And we know that at this period, adolescents show an important emotional liability. They are very, very influenced by social models, which is a good and a bad things at the same time, because they have a very fragile identity, so they can adopt models that come from outside. And they are very keen to adopt risk behaviors to test their self. So some of them, which the most vulnerable ones, when they enter adolescence with a fragile sense of self, can really be at risk of developing something like a negative self-perception, a negative identity, which can be very complicated to manage. And the problem that they have, that they want to be independent, they want to be autonomous, but they are really they need the support from others. And the paradox in which they are really stuck is that the more they feel threatened by the others, the more they need them, and vice versa. They need the support from others, but this support is threatening, especially their growing sense of self. So some of them may try to use maladaptive strategies to regulate the emotions associated with these changes. And they at risk of building a negative identity around these negative strategies they use to regulate emotions. But we have to talk about what happens to the brain of adolescents. In fact, if we consider that adolescents need to develop an autonomy and a new responsibility about their body and their way of behaving, this capacities to regulate behaviors, emotions are really important skills that must develop during the adolescent period. And these capacities, regulate behaviors and emotions, are really are related to specific neural systems that develop in adolescence. And we know that these neural networks are the executive networks. Planification, cognitive control, decision making, emotional regulation are all executive networks that translate them in the behaviors of autonomy and responsibility that adolescents show. And we know that there are major changes in the brain structures during this period in adolescence. You probably know the study that has been conducted by the National Institute of Mental Health some years ago that have repeatedly made scans from children and adolescents from 5 to 25 years, and they have shown great changes, especially between 10 and 25 years. They've shown a linear increase of white matter, which is probably related to a better myelinization, which improves the quickness, the rapidity of connections. And from the other side, a reduction of gray matter, which probably is related to synaptic pruning, which is important for selecting the networks which are the most important and the most functional at certain period of time. But if we see these two way of developing white matter and gray matter, this is not specific. It's very different according to the specific regions of the brain. In fact, if we use a very interesting model that's been proposed by Monica Ernst in 2006, this model tried to explain how there are different ways the brain is modified during adolescence. And she identified three important centers. The first one is the cognitive control, the prefrontal cortex. This is all the executive systems that regulate the behavior, that modulate the behavior, that inhibit the behavior, and can planify and regulate the behavior. The second very important center is what all the limbic system, and especially what is related to the amygdala and how we treat emotions in the daily life. And this is related to how we modulate emotions, but how we react to emotion in general. And the third important center that is really modify a lot during the adolescence is the reward system, which is focused on the striatum and the nucleus accumbens, which are specific regions which are close to the limbic system. What has been shown is that if the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, grows in a linear way, the reward system and the threat system have a curvilinear or quadratic development. It means that it is rapidly growing and becoming mature, but then it stops and then it reduces activities. Why is it important to show these changes in the way the nervous system functions? Is that what happens is that during adolescence, there is a very strong and quick development of the limbic regions, all the regions that are very active in reacting to emotions and in reacting to reward cues. Whether the prefrontal regions, which are those who are needed to control and regulate, are growing much slower. And there is a very this difference create a gap between the prefrontal and the limbic regions. And this gap is a very unstable period for adolescence. In fact, we can see that there is an hyperactivation of the threat system, and we know the adolescents react very quickly to every stimuli, especially emotional stimuli and negative stimuli. And they also need more reward. So they have an hyperactivation of the reward system. It means that they need to be rewarded in a very strong and intense and quick way to reinforce behavior. Those two, the reward system, the threat system, are very strong, very strongly activated in adolescence, whether the control system, the prefrontal control system, is less activated and it develops later till 20, 25 years of age. So there is really a gap between 13 and 25 years where the limbic regions are much more stronger and much more driving the behavior compared to the prefrontal regions that should limit and regulate the behavior. And we know we have many data that show, for example, if you ask an adolescent to look at a face, which is in this case a sad, a shocked, or surprised, or angry face, adolescents are used to react very quickly using the limbic system, whether adult people they use much more the frontal cortex to regulate and to understand and to see which kind of emotion is shown in the picture. Which it means that it's really a translation of the fact that adult people, when they are submitted to emotional stimuli, they can recruit the frontal cortex, which made them regulate or react in a much more thoughtful way. Whether adolescents react very quickly because they activate the limbic system, and this is really the quickness of the response, which can, in a very clear way, not be adapted to all the situation. So deep emotional relationships come from the ability to read subtle cues. More we are able to read subtle cues and to read them in an appropriate way, the most we are able to interact in an adapted way. So if we see in another manner, we can see that when the arousal in adolescence is low, adolescents are able to work, to function in an executive way, in a frontal way, with their prefrontal capacities. But when the arousal, the emotional stimuli, the context of emotional relationships start to grow, but then they start to use subcortical capacities, limbic capacities, limbic reactions, so much more emotional reactions. We as humans, we are all at risk of using subcortical, rapid, quick survival strategies when we are in a very difficult situation. But we use them when the stimuli are very strong, when the situation is very dangerous, when it we need we are very we have a threat, a real threat that is appearing. Adolescents can switch from a mentalizing strategies or cognitive or prefrontal strategy to defensive fight or flight strategies very much more quickly. And this is what happens also in patients with borderline personality disorders who are much quicker switcher from mentalizing to survival strategies. So this is really the situation in adolescence. Adolescents are prone to use fight or flight strategies in every situation, especially, and this is an important point, in situations where the emotional cues are relational. What happens, in fact, when we switch from a mentalizing functioning to a much more fight or flight or freeze strategies? It means strategies for survival. We can use very not flexible strategies. In the mentalizing model developed by Peter Fonagy and Tony Bateman, we used three way of calling non-mentalizing strategies or survival strategies when we observe patients and adolescents who are overwhelmed by emotions. The first one is what we call psychic equivalence. What it means that what is in the mind of the person is the same of the reality. There is something like a certitude about what happens. There is no other perspective that are possible. If I think that I'm wrong, if I think that everybody hate me, it means that it's the reality. Everybody hate me. There is no possibilities that somebody could have a different perspective on my experience. The second strategy that adolescents use a lot is what we call teleology, quick actions, concrete results, concrete strategies, which means, for example, self-cutting, which is a very quick strategy to regulate emotion, but it can be also the fact that only if somebody does something for me, I can understand what is his intention. I can have access to the intention of others only if they do things for me. And the third mode that we see a lot in adolescence is what we call pretend mode. In this case, reality and an external and internal reality are completely disconnected. It's what we call the dissociated mode. Adolescents and borderline adolescents do a lot. They can talk about things without emotions because they are not in touch with their emotions. The emotions and thoughts are not connected within them, between them. So when they can't reflect on their emotions, or they only act their emotions in reality. So these three modes are typically used a lot in adolescence when emotions grow. But it's interesting to know that it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen only when the emotion is intense in general. We know from some studies that when people, and especially adolescents or patients with the borderline personality disorders, are um, um, activated by some stress, some stimuli which are related to attachment, they don't activate all the brain regions that usually are activated when it's needed to regulate emotions. There are some regions in the brain, especially the sulcus temporalis posterior gyrus and the junction, the temporoparietal junction, which are activated when mentalization is needed, when reflections on emotions is needed. But when adolescents and adolescents with fragile identities are confronted with stimuli related to attachment, it means in general relationships, but they can't activate those brain regions and activates limbic regions and all what we have called strategies, survival strategies like psychic equivalence, teleological mode, or pretend mode. So fight, flight, or freezing strategies just to survive. So it means they feel threatened by something, and also they can't activate their reflective functions that could help them to regulate the experience. So it's very important to assess the emotional regulation, the emotional dysregulation of adolescents. And one of the problems of adolescents and adolescents, especially when they have borderline traits or borderline functioning, is they're really unable to understand and to monitor their emotions. They are much more traversed, the emotion passed through, but they can't really grasp them, they can't really name them, they can't really understand what happens. An adolescent can use the same word I'm hungry, I'm angry, to give all the nuances of emotions. We know that the most we have all a panel of emotions, most we can moderate them and regulate them. There is a very interesting way of reading emotions, that what we call the affective chronometry. The affective chronometry is a concept that's been developed by Richard Davidson, who is a neuroscientist, who talk about the individual variability in the time course of processing and responding to emotional stimuli. It means that all of us have a baseline level of emotions. Then when an emotion arrives, we react with a certain intensity. We go up to a certain level, and then we start to go down. But we are not at all similar in the way we react in our affective chronometry. We know that, and this is one of the best concepts of behavioral of dialectical behavioral therapy, that most of the patients that are shown to present a borderline personality disorder have a very low level of baseline, so a high level of a high baseline and a low level of starting activating emotion, a very low threshold for activating of emotion. They have a very strong, intense emotion, which is grows very quickly and go very high, and a very long return to the basic level. So, which means that most of the time they can't go back at the normal level, but they still be very high. So a new stimuli have a very important reaction, because it arrives when the level, the threshold is also modified and the reactivity is very high already. So this is what the model of Marshallinian has been proposed to show that there is in some people a very a huge emotional sensitivity with a low threshold. There is a heightened reactivity and a slow return to baseline, compared to other people, which which react, but grow in a very reduced way, but they get back to the baseline. And so when a new event arrives, they are already regulated. So the reaction is not very important. Whether somebody who is very high on his emotional reactivity, a new event can produce a disproportionated reaction from the outside. Maybe some of you know the model that is proposed by Alan Fruzzetti to show what is called the transactional model of emotional dysregulation. What happens that, see if we have a specific chronometry, affective chronometry, which is related to several emotional vulnerability, which can be biological, but also to be related to specific situations. An event can create a very intense dysregulation and heightened emotional activation, and which is immediately associated to a judgment about the event and the reaction itself. If I react with angry, I can immediately think I'm nasty, I'm something bad because I react in this way. So there is immediately an increase in the intensity of the emotion, which is associated with the judgment that the person gives to the emotion reaction. But if the emotion is not regulated, is expressed in a negative or in a non-accurate way. If I fear something, if I feel rejected, if I fear the abandonment from others, I can react with a very strong emotion and with anger, and expressing this with violent reactions. But in this way, I ask for help from others in a way that can't be understood by others. and other people will react with negative responses, what we call invalidating responses. It means that the environment will say, I can't support what you are saying, the way you express yourself, and so I reject you more and more by the inaccurate way the person has to express his emotions. And this is all the time associated with the new judgments, which brings more emotional activation, and this creates a vicious circle of invalidation between the person who expresses this and the environment, which react in invalidating negative ways that increase the dysregulation of the person. So when we have an adolescent which is expressing in a very not accurate way, dysregulated way, the environment, which is itself overwhelmed by emotions created by the expression of the adolescence, will react in an invalidating way, which put more oil on the fire, that which increase the dysregulation even more. So if you want to simplify this, it can be that an invalidated environment is itself responsible for an emotional dysregulation. But when the emotional dysregulation is expressed in a non-accurate way, this increases the invalidation and increase the negative response from the environment, which is at the origin of a consolidation of the way people dysregulate and don't regulate the emotions. So what we can do when we are faced with adolescents, which an emotional dysregulation that is at risk of becoming something stable and being associated with a possible borderline organization disorder, which use a lot of dysregulated behaviors to control the experience they do inside, especially about rejection, about fear of abandonment, and other shame feelings that are very strong in these adolescents. There are two things that are very important. So we can say that globally, adolescents which show emotional dysregulation lack interpersonal skills, lack emotional regulation, lack distress tolerance strategies to regulate emotions. When the emotions start to grow, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to manage it. They don't know how to communicate their feelings to others. So we need to learn them new skills. And that's what DBT does. DBT is a therapy which is built on learning new skills that make the regulation of emotion, the tolerance of distress more feasible, and the communication of the needs they have to others more efficacious. But there is a second point. We know that some situations can inhibit the use of skills. There are some contextual situations, and these are especially interpersonal situations, that block the capacity of using the skills. And so they will reinforce dysfunctional behaviors. So we don't just need to learn new skills like DBT does, but we need also to strengthen the ability to mentalize the situation, the context that can inhibit the use of skills, the use of mentalizing capacities, and this is what mentalization-based therapy does. So the two are very important, and I'm try to develop a model in which putting together the learning emotional regulation techniques of DBT and the support of the ability to mentalize, especially in emotionally charged situations of MBT. And I think that putting together these two models can really be very important in adolescents, especially for borderline adolescents. I think that most of you know how DBT works and how MBT works. I will just say that they show many features, many similar features. They have an individual part which is most of the time single sessions with adolescents, which is the main point is to reinforce motivation to change. There is a skill groups sections which really is to improve skills in the fourth main domain that are developed by the DBT technique. But all these two need to be generalized in the environment, and DBT use telephone coaching. And at the end, all the people working with adolescents with DBT need to work together because these are patients that can be hard to manage. MBT, so these are the 5 skill modules that are used in DBT, which are 4 of them are the same that for the adult people: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. But there is a 5th one, which is called walking the middle path, which has been specifically developed for the dialectics, the validation, the behavioral change of adolescents and their parents. When we look at MBT, they have also the 3 parts: individual therapy, but it works with identifying breaks in mentalization, the context, the emotional relationship that are difficult to manage in adolescents with history of threatening, insecure attachments. The psychoeducation group and the group therapy, which work on a mentalization because the mentalization is very activated in social situations. So this is a very specific situation to learn how to mentalize when emotion grows. And then all the team meetings needed to support the mentalization of the therapist, which is at risk with adolescents. And when we don't mentalize, we can't help other mentalize as well. So this is very important for adolescents, but is even more important with family. And we need to integrate systematically the family and the environment in this therapy with adolescent with emotional dysregulation. First of all, talking about psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is a basic strategy that should be used in a systematic way with adolescents that have emotional dysregulation problems. It means explaining what emotions are, why do they exist, how they are useful, how to get in touch with emotions, the relationship between body and mind. So all this part is very important to understand, to explain how emotions are a very important part of our way of being if they are useful cues to understand what happens inside and how to adapt to relationships. And so we can do that is by psychoeducation, but there is also a very important part, which this emotional support, validation, modeling regulation, helping setting empathic boundaries with families, which are important, extremely important part of the work we do with them. And so both DBT and MBT have specific modules, specific way of trying to ameliorate to build up a family intervention that is useful. And we know that DBT for adolescents is built on multi-family groups, which parents and adolescents are together learning skills that are taught by DBT. In MBT models, we use groups, family groups. We can use psychoeducation with a model with called FACT, that work on attachment, work on mentalization, work on what happens when emotions are activated by relationships. So it's really a psychoeducational skill groups, which is very interesting to share with parents. And we work a lot with the model, which is called family connection, which is a translation for families of the DBT model. But this is specifically well-structured program, and we built a network in Europe for promoting this model. But at the same time, there is the other model that was calling the FACT model that work with close family relationships of adolescents with emotional dysregulation problems. And both models are co-piloted by parents that have become experts in this regulation. So they can teach other people, other parents. And this is really a very useful way, because when parents and close relationships explain how they did, how they survived, how they found a way to better regulate their experience with their adolescence, this is much easier for other parents to use them, because there is a much more proximity, a closeness to the experience of others. Well, I will stop here and give some time to have exchange between us, with us.
Some more. Okay, thank you very much, Mario, for this really very comprehensive and integrative model and approach that you presented. Really, for adolescents, these two models work very well. Are there any questions that you would like to ask?
Feel free to ask and to disagree.
Perhaps I would like to ask, thank you. It was very interesting for me how you put these both perspectives together. But first, at the beginning, I was asking, how do you differentiate between normal adolescent and adolescent with personality disorder, because it's normal adolescent are not as much well, severely disturbed as borderline disorders. So that was my question.
Thank you, Annette. I agree. I start talking about emotions in general, and then I start talking about very disordered, emotional, dysregulated children and adolescents. In fact, I think that it's interesting to see that the mechanisms are quite similar between normal adolescents and very disturbed adolescents. But it's a question of intensity and the severity. For example, all the affective chronometry is much more stronger. But there is something that can happen, that even an adolescent with not so difficult affective chronometry can make the environment react in a way that can strengthen the negative strategies the adolescent is starting to use. That we have, there is a clear difference between a normal adolescence and an adolescent with borderline disorder or in a dysregulation. But there are some mechanisms that can become borderline provoking if the environment reacts in a negative and validating way, that can reinforce the negative strategies used by the adolescents, and so can become much more chronically settled and based with the repetition of negative interactions that have a negative impact on the self-identity, negative experience in relationships, a negative capacity of understanding emotion. So it makes like a negative vicious circle that can reinforce very strongly. So I think there is something dimensional, even if we can put a cutoff as a threshold. So the mechanisms are quite interesting to see in a dimensional perspective, more than categorical one.
Any other questions? I would like to. Oh, okay.
Yes, I would like to ask something, but I needed some help, maybe, hocam.
Okay.
Sizden. Okay. We talk about the emotional regulation processes, but in some adolescents, they have also some obstacles to define the emotion correctly. And their emotional repertoire is so limited. And before the teach some skills to regulate their emotions, how we work with these adolescents, first step maybe to define the emotion, because emotional portrayal is so limited. They
Yeah.
have yeah.
Yeah, I understand. You really,
That's
I agree completely with you. Adolescents are alexithemic. They don't understand. They are not in contact with their feelings, physical feelings. They can't put words on their emotions. They can't share emotion with others. So the first step with adolescents is doing what we call emotional literacy. We need to help them better know the emotions, understand emotions, experience different emotions, try to label them. So it's a very important thing. But to do this, you can do it in a very pedagogical way. You can even make a school of emotions. But what is much more important is to help them accept that emotions exist. So it's really in the DBT model is the mindful model. You need to look at your emotions, just not avoid them. But in the MBT model is make the experience of emotions and the embodied emotions that learn you things about what's happening in yourself. So you can do it in many ways. You can do it in psychotherapy. You can do it in other strategies like relaxation, school, really skill trainings. But it's a very important part of the work we do, and all the models work on that.
Thank you.
I would prefer not calling it an alexithymia, but rather, lacking mindfulness skills. You know, looking from more of a developmental perspective rather than the pathological.
Yeah.
Because what we are doing in DBT as well, by using mindfulness skills, we teach them actually to get aware of their emotions.
Yeah.
That is a part of the healthy adolescent development as well.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have to pathologize the difficulties they have to learn to know about emotions. There are many cultural problems in learning emotions. In some cultures, emotions are not very validated, and even between girls and boys, the emotions can be expressed in the same way. So there are many factors that play a role in learning how to manage emotions. And at the beginning, they are not very aware of emotions. It's clear. So it's a very important part for every kid to learn about emotions. But when I think about our more severe adolescents, they are not developmentally delayed. They don't know anything about emotions.
It's an awareness issue, it's just.
They are not aware at all. So
Yeah.
the first step is try to make them a little bit more aware. But to be aware, they should be also they should understand why emotions are important, why you don't need to avoid them. Emotions give a very important information about what happened. So you need to use it the best way you can.
And of course, one of the reasons to mention is that why they are kind of lacking this awareness is, again, has some biological rules. As Maria has pointed out, the development of the frontal cortex and the subcortical areas are not going in the same rate in adolescence.
No.
And they, the impulses, the emotional impulses make a short circuit there before, going to the frontal cortex, actually, before waiting to the control response from the cortex, they just make a shortcut to limbic system, which is the quickest way at that time. And that's how, that's also the forms a kind of biological basis that it's difficult for them to get aware of their emotions unless without some help, at least for some.
Yeah.
I just would like to mention, it just coincided with your presentation, Mario, that we had a research and from our clinic at Hacettepe, Ankara, and the paper is published in Adolescence, the journal Adolescence. This month it was published online before the New Year's, but now this month is published also as the printed form, which kind of measures the model you propose. We looked at the mentalization capacities of the adolescents which are lacking emotional regulation and which are actually self-injurious. That was a group we selected, and the results show that they are really lacking, and most of them are aware with no mentalization. You know, that is a form of the mismentalization or wrong mentalization capacity. So just to mention it.
Probably making this shortcut to limbic system is something that is very important, is needed. It makes adolescents more prone to action, which is an important thing.
Risk-taking.
Probably there is something useful from an evolutionary point of view. Adolescents must put them in danger, because it's very important for selecting specific useful network that can be useful in their lives. The problem is when these shortcuts are there are too many, and there's not the possibility. They don't have the possibility to modulate a little bit and to make choices according to the context.
But I think it's necessary to differentiate between the shortcut in adolescent and the problem of development in the early age, when a child does not learn to know about effects and then later to deal with them. And then you have really to teach them and to work on effect differentiation or realization, and it's another work than this shortcut when you can help the adolescent to mentalize and not to use a shortcut.
Yeah, but the problem is that they are very prone to use shortcuts when they are in relationships, and while relationships are important, this activate the attachment system. But for those who have a very insecure attachment, this make them really is equivalent of a threat from others, and an image of the self as a negative one. So things are so activated in a quick way, it's very difficult for them to mentalize at that moment. That's why relationships with adolescents, psychotherapy with adolescents, are so difficult, because we ask them to be in a relationship that is potentially threatening, even if what they need is this type of relationship and a modification of the experience that they have in relationships. This is a threatening situation for them.
Yeah, Enrico.
You don't.
Your mic is closed. We can't hear you.
Still.
Yeah. No.
It's still closed.
Perhaps the host can change it, huh?
I can try.
Please. Oh, yes, now.
Yes.
Okay.
I would like to know, in clinically speaking, how do you make this differentiation in the assessment phase? So, what kind of instruments you use? If you use a projective test, if you other kind of test, attachment scales, or if you are simply working in assessment in the clinical situation with adolescents.
It's a very easy question, a very easy answer to this question. It depends on the time I have and the situation I'm in. In the daily practice, we don't use questionnaire, we don't use projective tests, we don't use anything because we have so many adolescents we have to see, and most of them in emergency situations, that we just clinically assess this. This is the daily practice. If we have a little bit more time, there is a lot of things that we can do. I use several strategies. The first one is trying to make a visual formulation. It's not something that is validated, but as you've seen the activation, the affective chronometry, I work with them to define with them how they activate their emotions, which type of emotions activate, and with a specific intensity. What is the factors that are able to disorganize their way of controlling emotions? So it's very clinical, but using this affective chronometry profile. Otherwise, I use also a visual formulation of attachment, just seeing what happens when you're close to somebody, what happens when somebody you feel close or far from somebody others. So I'm just clinically I try to explore this. But otherwise, you can use a lot of instruments. I use an instrument that's been developed by an English researcher evaluating affective regulation. It's a screening instrument. We use the development of emotional regulation scale, which is a scale and a self-questionnaire. We use other way of exploring much more deeply using assessment of the development of personality dimension, self and identity, especially all the models that have been developed by Carla Sharp recently. So there are lots of things that you can do, but you do it for research. In the clinical practice, it's almost impossible to do it. I don't know what is your experience, but
Yes.
IDA is also another useful instrument developed by a German group, Annette also knows.
Which
IDA. IDA. IDA is an assessment for identity, but it measures the intensity of emotional issues and gives also a cutoff point for normal identity problems and borderline development. Kind of identity diffusion is considered as a borderline pathology. Yeah.
We have validated the IDA and the Lopfeld of a Christian Gott. So we can use it in the clinical situation, but not in the clinical practice.
Oh yes, there is a personality disorder questionnaire for adolescents, and if you use it, I know about somebody in a praxis who use it and knows, for instance, an eating disorder. She has big legs, having emotions, and so she is really working exactly on this lack of emotional capacity, and it's very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. But I guess I use much more the questionnaire to discuss with adolescents more than the scores they give. Because the scores doesn't really help a lot in the daily practice. But if you use some of the items, you read some of the items and say, what do you find this item close to the experience you do? And then you start talking with the adolescents. There are something like a way to get closer to your adolescent.
And that is also kind of working on mentalization, isn't it?
Yeah, with mentalization, you have a really a very playful strategy with adolescents. So you have to play with them. Otherwise, you get too intellectual, and then you just shut off by them. You're not anymore a partner.
Okay, I think we're
At the end of
just up time to finish. Thank you very much again, Mario, and thank you to all of you for attending this webinar. And we'll be continuing every 2 months on the last Fridays at 2 or 2:30 p.m. CET, Central European Time again. And you can see the announcements on the Isapp webpage. And we're also trying to send out the announcements on personal emails as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Zoom. Thank you, Mario.
See you soon.
See
Thank
you
you.
soon.
Thank you, Mario.